I'm opening the old McCormick file carefully, checking its enduring facts before the narration begins. Under the pale circle of a desk lamp, the McCormick notes wait beneath your hands. 2 creased pages whose crowded marks have led every patient decoder toward the same quiet uncertainty. Settle into the chair and let the room grow still around us. The paper seems ordinary at first, thin and slightly worn, yet its lines carry letters, numbers, dashes, and parentheses arranged in a private order that no one has confidently explained. We'll begin where the file begins, with a Missouri field in the summer of 1999, and with the small folded papers that gave the Ricky McCormick case its most enduring question. On the 30th of June, sheriff's officers found 41-year-old Ricky McCormick in rural St. Charles County, beyond the familiar streets where he had lived and worked. The surrounding land rested between the broad courses of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, where summer air collected above the grass and insects hummed steadily in the heat. There was little at the scene to explain how Ricky had arrived there, and the medical examination couldn't establish a clear cause of death. Yet investigators believed the circumstances deserved careful attention, so the file remained open, gathering interviews, photographs, reports, and the persistent weight of uncertainty. You can picture the first evidence table without bringing anything distressing into view, because what matters tonight is smaller and quieter than that. An officer empties the pockets of Ricky's clothing, and ordinary objects meet the cool surface beneath a fluorescent light. Among them are 2 handwritten notes, folded into compact shapes and covered with more than 30 lines of uneven writing. The pages make a dry sound as someone opens them, and a detective leans closer, expecting perhaps an address or telephone number, before realizing that the words won't readily become words. Capital letters stand beside numbers, while rounded parentheses hold certain groups apart and short dashes interrupt other sequences. Some characters appear clearly formed, though others hover between possible readings, because an N may resemble another mark, and a 5 may resemble an S. The handwriting moves with the confidence of someone who seems to know what comes next, even when you don't. There are repeated clusters, altered clusters, and lines that appear to have been organized for a practical purpose. As we sit with the McCormick notes, their first lesson is gentle but important. Seeing a pattern isn't the same as understanding its meaning. Investigators believed the papers might have been written within 3 days of Ricky's death, which placed them close to the final portion of his known timeline. That possibility gave every dash and parenthesis a particular importance, though no one could say whether the notes concerned travel, errands, personal thoughts, or something entirely unrelated. A grocery reminder can look mysterious when its writer invents abbreviations, while a meaningful record can look trivial without the key that shaped it. You turn the first page beneath the lamp, and already the case asks you to remain patient. Ricky's relatives described a man whose relationship with writing was unusual and deeply personal, though their later recollections didn't always agree with the earliest public descriptions. The Federal Bureau of Investigation said family members reported that he had used coded writing since childhood, while relatives later told a reporter they remembered scribbles rather than a deliberate cipher. Those accounts don't fit neatly together, and we shouldn't force them to do so. Memory changes around an old case, especially when years have passed. and a family learns that 2 pieces of paper were kept from public view for more than a decade. The difference matters because a conventional cipher leaves one kind of trail, while private shorthand leaves another. A cipher usually transforms language through a repeatable rule, such as substituting one character for another or rearranging letters according to a system. Shorthand may compress whole names, places, or familiar phrases into symbols meaningful only to its writer. If Ricky created the notes for himself, he didn't need to make them teachable, elegant, or consistent. You can almost feel the problem narrowing beneath your fingertips, then widening again, as every reasonable assumption opens onto another possibility. For a time, the pages remained within the larger investigation, their faint pencil strokes preserved, while detectives followed other lines of inquiry. Interviews were conducted, movements were considered, and connections were compared, yet the explanation for Ricky's death stayed beyond reach. Paper files accumulated in offices where telephones rang, typewriters and keyboards clicked, and coffee cooled beside stacks of unfinished work. The notes waited among those records, neither forgotten nor understood, their folded edges holding the shape of the pocket where they had been carried. By late 2001, the pages had reached the Federal Bureau of Investigation's code specialists in Quantico, Virginia. There, the McCormick notes entered a world of graph paper, statistical tables, sharpened pencils, and analysts trained to notice repetitions that most eyes pass over. Dan Olson, then working as a forensic examiner, began by counting the characters and studying the structure by hand. You can imagine the soft drag of pencil across ruled paper as he copied clusters, marked recurrences, and searched for the first dependable foothold. Olson spent roughly 2 solid weeks on that first concentrated examination, moving between manual work and computer analysis. On whiteboards, the strings could be enlarged and separated, while the faint chemical scent of dry erase ink lingered in the room. Software counted appearances and compared relationships far faster than a person could, but speed didn't provide context. The machines could say that a group returned. They couldn't say why it returned. As you follow the same path, you begin to understand why patient decoding is less like opening a lock and more like learning the habits of an absent mind. The analysts first needed to decide what sort of system they were seeing, and this was where progress became unexpectedly difficult. Before reconstructing a key, they had to know whether the writing represented English, another language, a substitution cipher, transposed text, abbreviations, or a personal code in which one letter might stand for an entire place. Each choice would require a different method. A frequency table, useful for ordinary substitution, may tell you very little about initials, directions, or reminders. The McCormick notes led their first professional readers, not toward an answer, but toward the calm recognition that the underlying question was still unknown. You might begin, as many decoders do, with the repeated groups, because repetition feels reassuring beneath the eye. A sequence that appears several times may represent a common word, a recurring name, a route, an instruction, or merely a grammatical ending. Yet the pages are short, and short samples can produce coincidences that seem more meaningful than they are. On a longer document, patterns have room to settle into reliable proportions. Here, each repeated mark carries too much responsibility. like a single quiet witness being asked to remember an entire afternoon. The letter E appears frequently, though even that apparently simple observation doesn't lead in only one direction. In ordinary English, E is common, so a decoder may wonder whether it has been left unchanged or substituted for another frequent character. Olson also considered whether it might act as a spacer, dividing compressed units where ordinary writing would leave a blank. But if E sometimes separates and sometimes belongs within a group, its role becomes unstable. You underline several examples, then lift the pencil again, because the evidence permits an idea without yet giving it strength. Other repeated groups invite the same cautious attention, especially combinations resembling NCBE, PRSE, and WLD. Their recurrence suggests structure, but structure alone doesn't identify what kind of structure has been found. One cluster might be a person's initials, another a common phrase, and another a location abbreviated according to a rule no outsider knows. You can read the pages aloud as letter names, softly and slowly, listening for a hidden rhythm. Nothing resolves, though the cadence begins to sound less random, and that faint order keeps the decoder's hand beside the page. Numbers appear among the letters as well, including short pairs and longer groups, and they naturally draw the eye toward dates, times, addresses, quantities, and road numbers. Parentheses contain several passages that resemble one another, tempting a patient reader to align them and look for changing fields. Perhaps the stable portions are labels, while the variable portions are values, much like entries in a simple ledger. Perhaps they record journeys, appointments, or transactions, yet without one confirmed meaning. Each interpretation remains a tracing laid over the page, clear while it rests there and gone when you lift the paper. This is the first place where many proposed solutions quietly fail, not because their authors lack imagination, but because imagination can fit almost anything to a short, unknown text. If you decide in advance that a number is a highway, nearby roads soon seem to confirm it. If you call the same number a date, a calendar may appear equally persuasive. A decoder must therefore ask whether one rule explains the entire note, including awkward lines that resist the favored idea. You hold that discipline close, because the most compassionate reading of Ricky's words is also the most careful one. Olson and his colleagues compared the numerical and alphabetical strings with street addresses around St. Louis, hoping that practical geography might offer a match. They also considered maps from elsewhere in the country, following the possibility that the notes described travel beyond the city. Paper maps unfold with a broad whisper, their creases catching the office light, while roads branch in orderly colors. Several fragments could be made to resemble places, as fragments often can. None rose above coincidence, and the maps eventually folded back into their drawers without providing a dependable destination. That outcome didn't mean the geographical idea was foolish, because Ricky's final movements were among the questions investigators most wanted to answer. A private note written shortly before his death might reasonably mention a street, a meeting place, a bus, or a sequence of turns. However, a useful hypothesis must predict something that wasn't chosen afterward to suit it. You may trace a finger along the river roads north of St. Louis, noticing the flat land and scattered settlements, while remembering that resemblance isn't confirmation. The McCormick notes had led the analysts onto many maps, but no map had yet led them back. The pages also seem to contain divisions resembling entries or separate tasks, with certain portions enclosed, crossed, or circled. Olson later observed that these marks might suggest a personal list, perhaps one in which completed items were indicated after the fact. That would explain why the notes look organized without behaving like a message intended for another reader. You can imagine Ricky unfolding the paper beneath the weak light of a bus shelter or shop counter, checking one familiar cluster and marking it with a pen. In that small, imagined act, the cipher becomes less like a challenge and more like an ordinary tool of memory. Yet even this gentle picture remains only a possibility, and another reader can see a very different purpose in the same circles. They might mark emphasis, separate categories, correct mistakes, or preserve groups that must be read together. Handwriting carries gestures that disappear when reduced to typed characters, so the physical page matters. Pressure changes, spacing widens, and a line bends slightly as the writer approaches an edge. When you study a reproduction, you're looking at both language and movement, though the warmth of the original hand has already cooled into evidence. The specialists invited colleagues to examine the material, because unfamiliar eyes sometimes notice what prolonged attention has made invisible. One analyst might treat the lines as substitution, another as phonetic spelling, and another as a compact record of names or events. Ideas gathered around the whiteboard, then underwent the slow work of testing. Most fell away because they explained only selected fragments or required rules that changed whenever the text became inconvenient. This is patient detective work in its purest form, where letting go of a pleasing answer can be as valuable as finding a new one. As the years passed, the McCormick notes moved to the background without leaving the minds of the people who had studied them. Other cases arrived at the laboratory, carrying coded prison letters, concealed records, threats, and private systems whose keys could often be reconstructed. Those successes sharpened the strangeness of these 2 pages, because the unit was accustomed to solving difficult material. Still, expertise doesn't create missing context. You can have a clear image, exact counts, and capable software, yet remain outside the small personal world where each abbreviation once felt obvious. Around the office, technology changed gradually, bringing stronger computers and new analytical tools, while the physical pages continued to age at their own quiet pace. Fresh staff joined the unit, and older questions could be approached with methods unavailable during the first examination. Olson, who eventually became chief of the cryptanalysis and racketeering records unit, chose to return to the case. You can feel the archive box opening again, its cardboard lid resisting slightly before releasing the dry smell of stored paper. Time hadn't solved the notes, but it had supplied new eyes. Roughly 15 of the unit's 20 analysts examined the writing during this renewed effort, applying different experience to the same stubborn lines. They counted, grouped, compared, and tested, while computers searched for relationships too numerous to assess by sight alone. Each analyst brought a slightly different instinct about spacing, language, or code construction. Yet no method produced a reading that remained stable across both pages. The work ended without a breakthrough, though not without knowledge, because every failed test quietly marked another route the McCormick notes probably did not follow. You turn the page again, and the lower corner gives a soft rasp against the desk. What looks like failure from a distance becomes a careful map of exclusions when viewed nearby. A simple substitution should leave certain statistical traces, while a transposition should preserve other features of the original language. If neither pattern behaves as expected, the decoder learns to consider codes based on whole words, personal associations, inconsistent spellings, or several systems combined. The absence of an answer is not empty. It has texture, boundaries, and a growing field of informed doubt. One obstacle remains especially plain. The sample is very small. More than 30 lines may sound generous until you divide them into uncertain characters, possible abbreviations, and groups whose boundaries aren't known. Statistical methods become stronger with length because genuine habits repeat, while coincidences gradually lose influence. 2 brief pages offer no such comfort. If you were given several notebooks in the same hand, recurring structures might reveal themselves like familiar paths through grass. With only these notes, every path ends before you can learn whether it was truly going anywhere. The investigators, therefore, hope to find another example of Ricky's writing, ideally one whose subject could be identified from context. A note beside a known telephone number, a labeled address, or an ordinary shopping reminder might provide the small bridge called a crib, linking coded material to probable plain language. Even a few confirmed words could expose how sounds, initials, and numbers were being used. Family drawers, old belongings, and remembered scraps thus became as important as advanced software. The missing key might not be a formula at all, but another folded page resting in an overlooked box. No comparable sample emerged, and this absence shaped every attempt that followed. If Ricky had written in the same manner since childhood, most examples may have been discarded because they looked like meaningless scraps. Paper slips vanish easily during moves, cleanings, and the ordinary sorting of possessions after years have passed. You can almost hear a kitchen drawer sliding shut, filled with rubber bands, receipts, dull pencils, and notes no one thought to save. An entire writing system can disappear that way, not through secrecy, but through the quiet habits of housekeeping. There was also the unresolved question of authorship, which became more complicated when Ricky's family publicly disputed the idea that he could have composed such a system. Some relatives said he struggled substantially with conventional reading and writing, and they didn't recognize the pages as a code he habitually used. The Bureau nevertheless maintained confidence that Ricky had written them, noting their personal, self-directed format. As you sit between these positions, it's best to leave room for both memory and analysis. A person's private marks may appear sophisticated to strangers and familiar as simple scribbling to those nearby. Limited literacy doesn't prevent someone from inventing a useful notation, because private systems need not obey standard spelling, grammar, or instruction. A person can recognize signs, initials, roots, repeated sounds, and visual shapes without composing ordinary prose easily. Indeed, an idiosyncratic notation may develop precisely because formal writing feels less natural. Yet that broad truth cannot establish who held the pen in this particular case. You study the pressure of each line and the repeated forms, aware that ability, authorship, and meaning are 3 separate doors, and none opens automatically with the same key. By the autumn of 2009, the search widened beyond the Bureau's own laboratory. In September, the McCormick notes were presented to about 25 members of the American Cryptogram Association, gathered for their annual convention in Niagara Falls, Ontario. These were practiced, amateur codebreakers, people who enjoyed the long companionship of difficult ciphers and understood how often a tiny inconsistency can matter. You can imagine the low murmur of their meeting room, the shuffle of photocopies, and rain-softened light against the windows as the pages passed from one attentive reader to another. Their setting may have been communal, but deciphering itself remained solitary, a pencil moving across margins while possible alphabets formed and dissolved. Some readers would begin with frequency counts, while others might compare repeated endings, count line lengths, or test whether the text should be read vertically. A few may have searched for familiar names concealed beneath substitutions. Each technique carries its own quiet hope, yet none produced an accepted solution. The notes left Niagara Falls as they had arrived, still legible in every mark and unreadable in their whole. This failure placed the pages in uncommon company, because most genuine ciphers examined by skilled analysts eventually yield to context, length, or a recognizable construction. Olson estimated that only a very small portion of material categorized as solvable remained unbroken by the unit. The McCormick notes appeared patterned rather than random, but they resisted the tools used on patterned writing. That contradiction kept them alive in professional memory. You return to the same repeated clusters, sensing why an analyst might set them aside for months, then wake one morning with a new comparison worth trying. It also encouraged a quieter possibility. Perhaps the writing wasn't encrypted in the usual sense at all. A personal shorthand can repeat because a life repeats, with the same people, streets, tasks, and needs returning through the week. Its units may represent sounds in one place and whole ideas in another, while spelling changes according to speed or mood. Such a system can be perfectly readable to its creator and nearly impossible for everyone else. If that was Ricky's method, cryptanalysis alone would always reach a boundary, where biography, geography, and daily habit had to take over the work. You might think of the distinction as the difference between a locked room and an unlabeled drawer. A locked room implies a mechanism designed to exclude you, and its lock may be studied until the tumblers align. An unlabeled drawer may contain ordinary things, arranged according to another person's memory, with no intention of hiding anything. The challenge is not defeating a barrier, but recovering a pattern of use. The McCormick notes may belong to either world, and every patient decoder has first had to decide which kind of silence lies on the page. Years of examination didn't settle that question, so the Bureau eventually chose an unusual next step and prepared the pages for public view. On the 29th of March, 2011, it released images of the notes and asked for help from anyone who recognized the system or could provide a new idea. The appeal wasn't presented as a contest with a clever prize, because the purpose remained connected to Ricky and the unanswered circumstances of his death. A fresh set of eyes, Olson hoped, might notice what long familiarity had hidden. The quiet file was about to move from one laboratory into thousands of rooms, across the country and far beyond it. Screens brightened with the same 2 pages. Retired engineers enlarged the handwriting at kitchen tables. Students printed copies in libraries, and hobbyists opened spreadsheets late into the evening. Some worked with software, while others preferred graph paper, colored pencils, index cards, and patient columns of hand-counted symbols. You can hear printers feeding sheets into dim home offices and teaspoons settling against cooling cups. For the first time, the McCormick notes belonged not only to investigators, but to a dispersed community of strangers practicing their own forms of attention. The responses came quickly, and in great number, because an unresolved code invites people to bring their own knowledge toward it. Thousands of suggestions eventually arrived, proposing addresses, directions, vehicle identifiers, financial records, wages, medications, appointments, and private transactions. Some readers believed the numbers corresponded to roads, while others saw dates or quantities. Certain interpretations sounded plausible for a line or two, then weakened when applied elsewhere. The Bureau reviewed the ideas, searching not for confidence or elegance, but for facts that could be tested against the case. By the following year, more than 7,000 public comments and theories had been received. The volume created another kind of patient work, less romantic than deciphering, but just as necessary. Each submission had to be read, compared, and judged for whether it contained a verifiable detail rather than a flexible interpretation. Several suggestions prompted conversations between federal analysts and local investigators, yet none brought an arrest or a significant public development. You can picture the growing digital folders, each one containing someone's careful evening, and each one returning the inquiry to its central stillness. Many proposed readings began by treating the letters as direct substitutions, because that is the familiar doorway into a cipher. If one symbol equals A wherever it appears, another equals B, and so forth, repeated coded groups should become repeated words. Common patterns may correspond to articles, pronouns, or endings, while single character units offer further clues. But the McCormick text doesn't cooperate consistently with simple mappings. A promising assignment in one line tends to create impossible or strained language elsewhere, and the decoder must either abandon it or invent exceptions that slowly consume the rule. Others tried transposition, asking whether the original letters remained present but had been moved into a different order. They read across, downward, backward, and through grids whose widths were chosen from line lengths or repeated numbers. On graph paper, the note could become a field of small squares, every character sitting neatly within a border. Diagonals emerged, columns aligned, and accidental fragments of language appeared with encouraging ease. Yet those fragments didn't extend into coherent text, reminding us that when enough arrangements are tested, chance will eventually whisper several familiar words. Some readers approached the writing phonetically, wondering whether clusters recorded the sounds of speech rather than conventional spelling. That idea suited the possibility of a writer who found standard literacy difficult, but had developed a reliable way to capture spoken language. A group such as WLD might represent a familiar sound, while repeated endings could reflect the rhythm of Ricky's own pronunciation. You can say the clusters slowly beneath your breath, letting consonants touch and vowels remain implied. Still, without a known phrase for comparison, phonetic freedom creates too many possible readings and too little proof. Another path treated individual letters as initials for people, places, or recurring activities. In such a code, a single R might mean Ricky, a road, a neighborhood, or a person whose name began that way, depending on context. This would explain why conventional frequency tests failed, because the units wouldn't correspond to ordinary letters within ordinary words. It would also make the text dependent on a social world investigators could only partly reconstruct. You could count every mark perfectly, and still miss the answer, because one faded capital referred to a nickname spoken only among a few friends. The numerical groups repeatedly drew decoders back toward maps, where highways and bus routes offered visible networks that seemed compatible with a life lived around St. Louis. Public proposals matched various numbers to roads, exits, street addresses, and transit lines, sometimes producing routes that passed meaningful places. Yet city networks are dense, and a handful of numbers can be made to touch many locations if the search area remains flexible. A convincing route would need to explain the surrounding letters, the order of entries, and the second page as well. Without that larger fit, the map remained pleasant to unfold, but unsafe to trust. Dates offered another calm avenue of inquiry, especially where pairs of numbers sat inside similar parenthetical structures. A decoder might see references to a month and year, birthdays, appointments, or earlier events important to Ricky. But the handwriting complicates even the basic transcription, because a character read as a 7 by one person may be interpreted differently by another. The apparent date must then be connected to something independently known. As you compare the rounded marks, the paper's ambiguity becomes almost tactile, like looking through old glass whose tiny ripples shift whatever lies behind it. Some theories proposed that the pages recorded routine transactions, perhaps quantities beside abbreviated goods or names. The repeated clusters could function as account labels, and circles might show completed exchanges or settled tasks. This ledger approach explains the compact format without requiring full sentences, but it also depends on identifying at least one reliable item. A ledger whose columns are invisible can resemble directions, reminders, or calculations with equal ease. You rest the pencil along the lower margin and notice how naturally the mind supplies order, even when the page itself has offered only spacing. Medical interpretations also appeared, partly because Ricky had sought care shortly before his death and had ongoing health concerns. Numbers could be dosages or dates, while repeated letters might abbreviate medicines, symptoms, or facilities. Such proposals carry an understandable desire to connect the notes with documented events. Yet, the same warning returns. A good explanation must work broadly and produce details that can be checked. If every cluster requires a newly invented abbreviation, the interpretation begins to describe the reader's expectations rather than Ricky's intention. Patient decoding means noticing that shift before it hardens into certainty. Other submissions suggested gambling records, vehicle numbers, personal calendars, or coded messages carried for someone else. Each idea illuminated one feature while leaving others in shade. A string that resembles an identifier may support the vehicle theory, while repeated small changes may suit a betting record. The possibility that Ricky served as a courier could account for writing he didn't author, though no public evidence has established that explanation. You place these theories side by side without ranking them by drama, because the quiet file asks only whether any one of them can survive careful testing. The public effort revealed something about codes that professional tools alone can't show. Every reader brings a personal map of familiar patterns. A transit worker sees routes, a pharmacist notices possible abbreviations, and a linguist hears fragments of sound. This diversity can generate the fresh insight an investigation needs, but it can also multiply coincidence. The Bureau's task was therefore to separate recognition from projection, a distinction that often becomes clear only after many hours. We sit beside that work tonight, not hurrying toward a favorite answer, but listening for the rare idea that makes the rest of the page grow simpler. No accepted solution emerged from the thousands of attempts, and the reason may lie less in the complexity of the code than in the missing world around it. If a line refers to a person by a private nickname, no frequency table can recover the name without outside knowledge. If a number means the third stop on a route Ricky knew by habit, a national map search may never identify it. The decoder needs context, yet the hoped-for context may be encoded on the page. You feel the circle closing gently, one unknown supporting another, while the lamp makes a small island of light across the desk. Still, the attempts weren't wasted, because they traced the boundaries of what could responsibly be claimed. Simple substitution had not yielded coherent language. Transposition had not produced a stable reading, and geographic matches had remained coincidental. Phonetic and shorthand approaches stayed possible, though they lacked a second sample for comparison. Each patient decoder arrived by a different path, near the same place. The notes looked purposeful, but purpose couldn't yet be translated. That shared destination is quieter than a solution, though it tells us exactly where the next useful piece of evidence would need to land. When the next copy of the McCormick notes comes down from the shelf, our attention moves away from proposed keys and toward the marks themselves, where spacing, repetition, pen movement, and the shape of an ordinary private list may preserve what broad theories have missed. You adjust the page beneath the lamp, and the paper settles with a faint, dry sound. One cluster begins like another, but ends differently, while a parenthesis gathers several signs into a unit whose purpose remains unknown. Before assigning meaning, we'll stay with that physical pattern a little longer, allowing Ricky's handwriting to set the pace. The first difficulty is deciding what each character actually is, because the photocopied strokes carry small ambiguities that no amount of theory can erase. You find a shape resembling an S in one line, then a nearly identical mark resembling the number 5 in another. An upright stroke may be the letter I, the number 1, or part of a hurried neighboring character. Before the McCormick notes can be decoded, they must be transcribed, and transcription itself becomes the first quiet act of interpretation. You place two proposed transcriptions beside each other and notice disagreements in places that seemed clear only moments ago. One reader separates a cluster at a faint gap, while another treats the same sequence as a single unit. A mark touching the next letter may be accidental, or it may show that both belong together. Even the ends of lines raise questions, since Ricky may have stopped at the margin, continued elsewhere, or begun a new thought without punctuation. The page doesn't announce its grammar, so you must infer the shape of that grammar from space. Spacing appears uneven throughout the writing, yet unevenness may carry meaning when someone writes only for himself. A wide gap could divide words, separate entries, or simply mark where the pen paused while the writer remembered what came next. Narrow gaps may unite symbols, though a fast hand naturally compresses unrelated forms. You can imagine the paper resting against a knee, a counter, or another imperfect surface, with every small movement altering the line. What looks like a coded boundary may sometimes be nothing more than the physical moment of writing. Pen pressure offers another faint trail, though reproductions preserve it poorly. A darker stroke may indicate emphasis, a correction, or merely a pen held at a steeper angle. Where a character has been retraced, the writer may have clarified it for later reading, suggesting that even Ricky could expect confusion when returning to the note. You lean nearer, almost feeling the drag of the point through the paper fibers. The marks aren't mechanical symbols placed with equal force. They are gestures, and every gesture carries both information and noise. Several sections appear contained by parentheses, whose curves create small rooms within the crowded writing. The enclosed groups resemble one another in form, leading some decoders to treat them as repeated templates with changing details. Perhaps they mark dates, destinations, completed tasks, or explanatory asides. Yet parentheses in personal writing needn't follow formal rules, especially when the author never expected another reader. You circle the circles on your copy, then pause, aware that visual emphasis can make one family of symbols seem more central than it truly is. A conventional decoder often begins by creating an exact inventory, assigning a neutral label to every distinct mark before guessing what any mark means. The uncertain S-like character might become one symbol, while the clearly formed 5 becomes another, at least until evidence supports combining them. Such caution prevents an early assumption from shaping every later count. You can hear the faint tapping of keys as a transcription grows, line by line, each uncertain character tagged rather than forced into certainty. This slow neutrality is valuable because the McCormick notes have already attracted more confidence than their small sample can carry. Once the inventory is made, frequency counts reveal which symbols appear most often, both alone and beside particular neighbors. In ordinary written English, certain letters occur frequently, while familiar pairs and endings create their own statistical signatures. But Ricky's pages may omit vowels, compress words, or use one sign for several meanings, which would distort those expectations. A frequent E-like symbol might represent a common letter, a separator, an entire word, or a repeated category. You write its count in the margin, letting the number remain simply a number. The position of a repeated symbol can matter as much as its frequency. If it regularly appears at the end of groups, it might behave like an ending, punctuation mark, or boundary. If it occurs between similar clusters, perhaps it joins entries or separates fields. Yet the unknown spacing makes positional analysis circular, because you need word boundaries to study endings, and endings to confirm word boundaries. The McCormick notes lead you around this gentle loop, where each answer waits politely for another answer to arrive first. A decoder may test several segmentation schemes without committing to one, producing alternate versions of the same page. In one version, spaces define words. In another, dashes become the primary separators. In a third, recurring clusters determine the divisions. Each arrangement changes the statistical picture, sometimes dramatically. A common 4-character unit may disappear when its final letter becomes a divider, while a rare sequence may suddenly recur across line breaks. You turn these versions like transparent overlays, searching for the arrangement that reduces uncertainty rather than merely moving it around. The dashes seem especially inviting because they look deliberate, but their function remains unsettled. They might represent pauses, hyphens, minus signs, separators, or a repeated word omitted for speed. A dash could also show that the writer abandoned one thought and began another, a habit common in private notes. If every dash receives the same role, some lines become cleaner while others become less plausible. The page reminds you that consistency is something to discover, not something to impose, and so the dash remains a small horizontal question. Line breaks create similar uncertainty because they may divide complete entries or simply reflect the width of the paper. Some lines appear compact and self-contained, while others feel as though they might continue into the next. If the text was copied from another source, breaks could preserve an earlier layout. If written spontaneously, they might follow pauses in thought. You trace the right margin downward and watch the endings form an irregular edge. No line reaches out to explain whether its boundary belongs to language, memory, or the available room. Reading direction becomes the next patient experiment. English usually moves from left to right, but a private system could reverse words, alternate directions, run vertically, or begin at an unexpected corner. Analysts test these possibilities because unusual direction can disguise ordinary text without changing its characters. The pages can be mirrored, rotated, divided into columns, and read along diagonals. Most arrangements produce occasional familiar fragments, as random rearrangements often do, but none sustains a convincing voice. The appearance of fragments is one of the quiet hazards of code work. Human perception is skilled at finding known shapes within incomplete material, whether faces in cloud cover or words inside long strings of letters. A decoder who discovers a promising name may unconsciously adjust nearby symbols to support it. One uncertain 5 becomes an S, a faint gap becomes a boundary, and the emerging phrase begins to feel inevitable. You step back from the page at such moments, allowing your eyes to cool before asking whether the same rules explain what comes afterward. Responsible solutions must do more than produce readable language from selected passages. They should account for repeated clusters consistently, explain the numbers and punctuation, and work across both pages without frequent exceptions. Ideally, they should also reveal information that can be checked against facts unknown to the decoder beforehand. A proposed reading that merely echoes public details may reflect those details rather than uncovering Ricky's meaning. You keep this standard beside the lamp like a straightedge, simple and firm, protecting the case from attractive but unsupported answers. Some solvers begin with probable words, a technique known as using cribs, by guessing that a recurring group might represent a name or common term. In many historical ciphers, one correctly placed crib allows the surrounding system to unfold. Here, however, there is no confirmed greeting, signature, or repeated phrase to anchor the guess. The notes may not contain sentences at all. You could assign one cluster to Ricky, another to St. Louis, and a third to a familiar road, yet the assignment would remain a story laid gently over silence. The absence of vowels has drawn particular attention, though it is difficult to know whether vowels are truly absent when the underlying words remain unknown. Many ordinary note-taking systems remove vowels while preserving enough consonants for the writer to recognize the intended phrase. A grocery list might reduce familiar items to their first and last sounds, while a name could shrink into initials. If Ricky used this method, the repeated strings may be compressed speech rather than encrypted spelling. You whisper several possibilities, then hear how many different phrases can occupy the same consonant frame. This freedom makes shorthand efficient for its author and difficult for everyone else. When you write a familiar name with 2 letters, memory supplies everything omitted, including the person, setting, and reason for writing it. An outsider receives only the shell. The McCormick notes may contain many such shells, each waiting for a context that disappeared with Ricky. Their mystery would then arise not from elaborate concealment, but from the ordinary intimacy between a person and his own memory. Personal shorthand also changes over time, which weakens the assumption that one fixed key governs every line. A symbol may begin as an abbreviation for a street, then later become a reminder of someone associated with that street. Numbers may refer to bus routes in one passage and amounts in another. Formal codebreakers expect rules, because rules make systems usable across messages. But private notes need only remain usable to one person in one moment. You allow the possibility of inconsistency without treating it as meaninglessness, a distinction requiring unusual patience. At the same time, inconsistency can be invoked too easily whenever a proposed reading fails. If every mismatch is explained as Ricky changing his method, misspelling a word, or omitting another character, then no evidence can disprove the theory. A useful interpretation must place limits on its own flexibility. You ask what the rule predicts before examining the next cluster, then see whether that prediction holds. The pencil waits above the paper, and the discipline of not writing can become more important than the excitement of filling a blank. Another approach treats the repeated strings as syllables rather than letters or words. A cluster could encode a sound unit that appears within several spoken phrases, allowing slight variations to reflect pronunciation. This might explain why some sequences overlap or share endings without behaving like standard words. Yet syllabic systems usually reveal recurring combinations when enough text is available, and again the sample is small. You arrange several clusters on index cards, moving related forms together until the desk resembles a quiet family of shapes. The visual arrangement may itself contain categories. Lines beginning with similar symbols could represent entries of the same kind, while parenthetical sections might supply dates or comments. Repeated prefixes may function as labels, such as person, place, amount, or action. A decoder can compare the internal structure without assigning actual meanings, much as a linguist studies an unfamiliar language by observing where forms occur. The method is slow but honest. You learn that certain clusters behave alike, even while their identities remain beyond the edge of knowledge. One can construct a simple table showing every recurring group and the lines where it appears. The paper rustles as the table expands, and colored marks connect distant passages that share a beginning or ending. Some repetitions seem strong enough to support deliberate structure, while others may result from the limited alphabet visible on the pages. If the writer favored a small set of letters, accidental recurrence would naturally increase. The decoder therefore measures not only how often a group repeats, but how surprising that repetition would be under a plausible baseline. This is where computation can help without replacing judgment. A program can count thousands of possible groupings, compare them with language models, and test transformations at speeds no human hand can match. It can score outputs for resemblance to English, names, or known abbreviations. But the program must be told what kind of transformation to test, and the correct family of transformations may never enter the search. You hear the cooling fan of a computer beneath the desk, steady and soft, while the machine explores a vast garden whose gate was chosen by a person. If the notes use a simple substitution, modern search methods should often find strong candidates, even when spacing is imperfect. If they use homophones, with several symbols representing the same letter, the search becomes harder, but still leaves certain patterns. If whole words are replaced by arbitrary codes, statistical language tools may have very little purchase. Each method assumes a relationship between the visible text and hidden language. The McCormick notes may resist because that relationship is obscure, mixed, or dependent on information that never entered the file. A book cipher is sometimes proposed when numbers and letters appear together, since such systems use references to pages, lines, or words in another text. Without the correct book, the coded message can remain impenetrable despite being perfectly systematic. Yet book ciphers usually display numerical regularities consistent with indexed references, and Ricky's pages don't plainly announce such a design. No companion volume was identified as their key. You glance toward the shelves around the imagined office, recognizing how many books could fit a theory that provides no way to choose among them. Other decoders wonder whether the writing relies on a keyboard, telephone keypad, calendar, or alphabet grid. Numbers might indicate movements, while letters provide starting positions or category labels. These ideas are easy to test in their simplest forms, and many produce scattered fragments without yielding an entire reading. A system complicated enough to fit every anomaly risks becoming indistinguishable from invention. You return to the physical note, where the imperfect handwriting feels more like a hurried personal practice than the output of a carefully designed machine. The possibility of a calendar remains appealing because several numerical pairs resemble years or dates. Parenthetical groups could preserve appointments, anniversaries, or earlier events, while surrounding letters name people or purposes. But some proposed dates would reach decades into Ricky's past, and no consistent connection has been demonstrated. Dates are common shapes in mixed writing, so the resemblance carries little weight alone. You imagine turning pages in an old appointment book, where confirmed entries would sit beside known days, and feel again the absence of such a companion. Addresses create the same temptation, especially in a metropolitan case where many numbered streets, buildings, highways, and routes exist. A sequence can often be mapped somewhere if the decoder is free to choose how digits are grouped and which region to search. What matters is whether several independent sequences point to related places in the correct order. The FBI compared the notes with addresses and maps without finding a match beyond coincidence. You fold the map slowly and leave one corner visible, because geography remains possible even when no particular geography has been proved. Transit theories possess a gentle, practical appeal. Ricky relied on the city around him, and a personal note might record buses, transfers, stops, or times in compressed form. Repeated route numbers could explain recurring digits, while letters might abbreviate destinations. Yet route systems change, requiring historical timetables rather than modern maps, and even period schedules may not capture informal landmarks used by riders. A bus number can also resemble a date or quantity. You can almost smell vinyl seats warmed by summer and hear coins settle into a fare box, while keeping the image separate from evidence. Some public decoders have tried matching clusters with roadway directions beyond Missouri, including journeys Ricky was reported to have made. The method begins with known travel and searches the note for corresponding names, states, exits, or distances. But known travel can exert a strong pull, encouraging ambiguous marks to conform to expected locations. Unless the decoded sequence predicts an unreported stop later verified by records, it remains an echo of the biography already available. You follow the imagined highway only until the page ceases to support it, then return quietly to the desk. Ledger theories lead in another direction, toward quantities and repeated parties rather than roads. Here, stable clusters may name people or goods, while changing numbers record amounts, dates, or balances. Parentheses could mark completed entries, and circles might show items requiring attention. This framework explains why the lines lack ordinary sentence structure. Still, a ledger usually reveals columns or consistent ordering, and the McCormick notes only partly resemble that form. You draw tentative vertical lines through the transcription, then erase them when the supposed columns drift apart beneath your hand. A telephone interpretation is equally understandable, since personal notes often preserve numbers beside abbreviated names. The numerical sequences, however, don't clearly settle into the standard lengths expected for local or long-distance telephone numbers of that period. They can be made to do so by combining or separating marks, but those choices must be justified independently. No publicly confirmed call record has been linked to a decoded line. The receiver in the imagined records room remains on its cradle, and the uncalled number stays hidden somewhere among letters that may never have represented a telephone at all. Some readers have treated the pages as a set of names, perhaps people Ricky intended to contact or had recently encountered. Repeating beginnings could mark shared surnames, locations, or roles, while varying endings distinguish individuals. This would make the note valuable to investigators, yet exceptionally hard to decode without a known roster. Names don't follow ordinary word frequencies reliably, and nicknames can take almost any form. You leaf through interview summaries, hearing the soft flip of paper, but no sequence aligns strongly enough to turn a coded cluster into a verified person. Another possibility is that the writing combines ordinary abbreviations with invented spelling and occasional numbers, rather than employing encryption at all. Under this view, asking for a cryptographic key may be asking the wrong question. The relevant skill would be reconstructing Ricky's personal language through many examples, much as an archivist learns a diarist's habits. But the necessary archive doesn't exist. You have 2 pages without a glossary, 2 moments without a dated notebook, and a lifetime of unwritten context resting outside the folder. The family's recollections become especially significant here, though they must be handled with tenderness. Relatives knew Ricky as a person, not as a cryptographic subject, and their memories of his literacy and habits carry a texture no statistical table can provide. At the same time, they may not have watched every private act of writing or retained scraps that seemed unimportant. The Bureau's analysts saw patterns suggesting meaningful construction, while family members saw marks resembling the scribbles they remembered. You don't have to choose disrespectfully between them. Both views may describe different sides of the same practice. An analyst may call a text non-random because repeated patterns, structural divisions, and character distributions suggest intentional organization. Non-random, however, doesn't necessarily mean linguistic, encrypted, or connected to the death under investigation. A person can create patterned notes for games, private fantasies, calculations, or habits no outsider could reconstruct. The distinction is modest but essential. As you hold the McCormick notes beneath the lamp, you let them be meaningful without insisting that their meaning must answer every question the case has placed upon them. That restraint matters, because the papers have carried an extraordinary burden since their release. They were described as potentially revealing Ricky's whereabouts before his death, or identifying people he encountered, which naturally guided decoders toward consequential readings. A proposed grocery list can feel disappointingly ordinary beside such hopes, though ordinary content remains entirely possible. Olson himself acknowledged that even a mundane solution would matter, because learning the system could still illuminate the writer and test investigative assumptions. You allow the pages to contain errands, affection, travel, or confusion with equal dignity. The most patient decoders often spend more time disproving their first idea than defending it. They create a key, apply it across every line, and record where it works, without quietly hiding where it fails. They compare the resulting language against expected frequencies and ask whether exceptions arise naturally or only through adjustment. Then they give the material to someone who doesn't know the hoped-for answer. In this careful exchange, ego grows quieter, and the notes become evidence again, rather than a mirror for the solver's cleverness. Independent replication is especially valuable when handwriting is ambiguous. If several readers, using the same stated rules, produce the same plain text from the same image, the proposal gains strength. If each must choose different characters or boundaries to preserve the result, the solution weakens. Many public claims about the McCormick notes offer compelling passages, but no complete, reproducible method. You can appreciate the hours behind them, while still leaving them outside the accepted file, because kindness and skepticism can share the same chair. The Bureau received so many theories that reviewing them became a substantial project of its own. Analysts had to distinguish novel information from variations of familiar approaches, while local investigators considered whether any suggestion connected with known evidence. 7 or 8 discussions reportedly arose from submissions that seemed potentially useful, showing that public work wasn't simply dismissed. Yet those conversations didn't produce a publicly identified breakthrough. Somewhere, a stack of promising ideas narrowed under scrutiny, each one handled before being placed gently back into uncertainty. This sorting process resembles archival work more than the dramatic image of code breaking. A submission arrives, receives a reference, and is compared against earlier suggestions. Names must be checked, locations mapped, and factual claims separated from interpretive leaps. The room may smell of toner and old files, while afternoon light changes almost imperceptibly across the carpet. You sit with the analysts through that long middle distance, where progress consists of removing possibilities carefully enough that a genuine clue, should it appear, won't be buried beneath enthusiasm. The American Cryptogram Association's involvement also reminds us that patient expertise can exist outside official institutions, Its members study classical systems, historical puzzles, and the small quirks by which one kind of encipherment differs from another. Their failure to solve the notes wasn't a verdict of impossibility, only evidence that familiar methods lacked sufficient purchase. A missing key, unusual shorthand, or uncertain transcription could frustrate even excellent technique. You hear pencils pause across the convention room, not in defeat, but in recognition that the material requires something they don't yet have. Cryptanalysis usually benefits from several messages produced by the same system. Repetition across documents reveals what repetition within one brief note cannot, and changing subjects expose stable elements of the key. If the McCormick notes are one instance of a lifelong habit, earlier pages would be more valuable than thousands of new guesses. A single scrap labeled by circumstance could settle whether recurring symbols mean dates, places, or actions. You imagine an old envelope in the back of a drawer, its paper softened by years, waiting with one familiar cluster beside a clearly written name. No such sample has entered the public account, and its absence grows more poignant with time. Objects disappear when apartments are cleared, relatives move, and ordinary paper is judged too slight to preserve. By the time investigators know what they need, the needed item may already have passed through many hands or into refuse. Cold cases often turn on this mismatch between the moment evidence exists and the later moment its value becomes clear. You can feel the archive room's cool air around us, where survival itself is often the first act of chance. Modern image analysis might improve the transcription by separating pen strokes, comparing repeated characters, and revealing pressure differences preserved in high-resolution photographs. Yet, enhancement cannot restore information the original page never contained, and algorithms may sharpen artifacts along with genuine marks. A clearer curve might help distinguish one character, but it won't explain what that character meant to Ricky. Technology can bring us nearer to the ink, without necessarily bringing us nearer to the thought. You enlarge the page until individual fibers appear, and the message seems both closer and more distant. Handwriting comparison could also address authorship if enough known samples existed. Examiners would study letter formation, slant, spacing, connecting strokes, and repeated habits difficult to imitate consistently. But a coded or abbreviated note may use forms unlike ordinary writing, and limited comparison material reduces confidence. The Bureau maintained that Ricky likely wrote the pages, while some outside observers questioned that conclusion. You keep the authorship line open in the notebook, neither erased nor inked permanently, because the identity of the writer changes every later assumption. If someone else wrote the notes, their compact style might indicate instructions, records, or information Ricky was carrying. The pages could then be meant for another recipient who understood the system, making consistency more likely and authorship comparison more important. Yet, this courier idea has not been established by public evidence, and it can become too convenient when other theories fail. A mystery readily absorbs another unknown person. You allow the possibility to remain, but you don't let it walk farther than the evidence permits, keeping its footsteps soft within the margin. If Ricky wrote them himself, the circles and repeated segments may reflect an intimate routine of checking, remembering, and organizing. The apparent code could be something closer to a personal planner. built without formal rules and adjusted whenever convenience required. Such systems sometimes appear opaque, even to their creators after enough time has passed. A note that was perfectly clear on Tuesday may become puzzling by winter. You think of your own hurried reminders, where 2 words once carried an entire day and later leave only a pale impression of purpose. This human comparison doesn't solve the notes, but it changes how we sit with them. They aren't merely an intellectual obstacle placed before experts. They are among the last surviving objects associated with a man whose inner life was often described by others rather than preserved in his own words. Whatever they contain, they reflect a way Ricky arranged something for himself or carried something given to him. The cramped lines deserve more than curiosity. Beneath every proposed key rests the quieter obligation to remember the writer. Ricky lived on the margins of several systems that generate records, including hospitals, courts, workplaces, housing, and public transportation. Investigators could compare dates and movements across these sources, seeking points where a coded number might align with a documented event. Yet, institutional records are incomplete, and the daily life between appointments seldom leaves a clean trail. A hospital ticket may confirm one visit without explaining the hours around it. You lay one timeline beside another, noticing how official documents create bright points separated by long stretches of ordinary darkness. Timeline matching can become powerful when a sequence of coded entries corresponds to independently dated events. If several numerical groups align in order with known visits or journeys, the chance of coincidence declines. But choosing dates after examining the code reverses that logic, allowing the solver to select whichever events fit. Patient work requires establishing the decoding rule first, then testing it against unused records. You draw a vertical line down the notebook page and keep prediction on one side, confirmation on the other, preserving a small but crucial distance. Geographic matching requires the same discipline. A credible interpretation should produce a specific location before the decoder searches for it, not emerge from scanning maps until something resembles the desired letters. Historical street directories, transit schedules, and business listings can then test the prediction. If the predicted place connects independently to Ricky's known movements, the result becomes meaningful. Until then, even an elegant map remains an illustration rather than evidence. You let the river lines curve quietly across the paper, beautiful in their certainty and silent about the note. Several numerical strings have been compared with coordinates, another modern instinct encouraged by the way location is now commonly expressed. But coordinate notation familiar today wasn't necessarily part of Ricky's daily writing in 1999, and the visible numbers don't unambiguously fit a single geographic format. With adjustable decimal points and directions, countless locations become available. A correct coordinate theory would need a consistent convention and a reason Ricky possessed the relevant values. You close the digital map and return to the older world of paper addresses, remembered corners, and spoken directions. Telephone keypads inspire another family of transformations, because letters can be converted into numbers through familiar groupings. The process may run in either direction, with digits standing for several possible letters and surrounding context narrowing the choice. Yet the McCormick pages already contain both letters and numbers, So any keypad theory must explain why some elements were transformed while others remained visible. Mixed systems are possible, but each additional rule raises the burden of proof. The soft buttons of an old telephone offer a tempting pattern. Though temptation isn't yet a key, alphabet shifts are tested almost automatically, from simple rotations to more elaborate sequences controlled by numbers. These methods can be applied quickly, and their failure removes a broad set of familiar possibilities. Polyalphabetic ciphers, where substitutions change across the message, are harder, especially without spacing or a known key. But such systems usually require deliberate construction and reliable operation by the writer. You ask whether the note looks like the product of that effort, while remembering that appearance alone cannot decide what skill or assistance Ricky may have used. Transposition grids invite patient experimentation because the line lengths and numerical groups might suggest widths. Characters can be written into rectangles and read by columns, spirals, roots, or alternating rows. The results occasionally produce short, English-like segments, but a genuine method should generate sustained coherence and explain the choice of grid. Without those features, the fragments remain statistical accidents. You smooth the graph paper with your palm, seeing row after row of careful labor, and respect the attempt, even as the proposed route dissolves into letters. Null characters offer another explanation for resistance. A writer may insert meaningless symbols to obscure the important ones, making frequency patterns less reliable. If every second character, every symbol after a dash, or every item within parentheses is discarded, hidden text might appear. The number of possible selection rules is enormous, however, and almost any desired phrase can be extracted if enough freedom is allowed. You test only rules suggested by visible structure, refusing to pluck isolated letters merely because they spell something familiar. Acrostic methods look at first letters, final letters, alternating positions, or repeated symbols along the edges of lines. These are reasonable because the page's layout may preserve information beyond ordinary reading order. Yet, the uncertain transcription and line breaks make edge-based methods fragile. If one line was wrapped for lack of space, the entire extraction shifts. A few recognizable letters appear, then fade. You follow them only as far as the stated rule carries you, allowing coincidence to remain a normal property of any sufficiently varied text. The notes have also been compared with invented languages, phonetic spellings, and forms of playful word transformation. A childhood system might reverse syllables, insert recurring sounds, or replace common words with private terms. Family recollections about long-standing unusual writing make this avenue understandable, though those recollections themselves remain disputed. Childhood codes often depend on shared knowledge between friends or siblings, and no confirmed partner has supplied a key. You listen for the echo of an old game in the clusters, but the room answers only with the steady hum of air. Linguists might ask whether the sequences obey constraints resembling natural language. Certain symbols rarely appear together. Some clusters favor the beginnings of lines, and repeated endings may behave like grammatical markers. Statistical measures can compare these patterns with English, other languages, shorthand, and random generation. But a sample this small produces wide uncertainty, especially when character identities and boundaries remain unsettled. The result may indicate that the writing is structured without identifying the structure. You record that modest finding carefully, because modest findings are often the most durable ones. Randomness itself requires a precise meaning. A page can be non-random because the writer repeats favorite shapes, copies earlier clusters, or follows a visual rhythm, even if no hidden message exists. Conversely, an encrypted message can look highly random when a strong method deliberately flattens ordinary frequencies. Olson believed the McCormick notes were not meaningless, based on their patterns and format. You respect that experienced judgment, while remembering that purpose has many forms, only some of which can be recovered through language. The possibility of a semic or non-linguistic personal writing has been raised by some observers, especially given descriptions of Ricky's unusual habits. Such marks can feel meaningful to their creator without encoding a stable sentence available for later translation. They may support thought, fantasy, memory, or emotional order rather than record exact words, yet declaring the notes meaningless would be as premature as declaring them solved. You keep them in the middle ground, where intentional form and inaccessible content can coexist without either being diminished to nothing. For investigators, the practical question remains whether any interpretation can illuminate Ricky's final movements. A theoretically elegant solution matters less than a verifiable name, place, time, or event connected to the existing file. That standard gives the decoding effort an investigative direction, without requiring every symbol to be understood. Even one confirmed cluster could become a doorway into the rest. You search the repeated groups for something that might appear in records, while knowing that the page won't tell you which group deserves that first trust. Names are especially valuable because they can be compared with interview lists and contemporary directories. But names are also dangerous anchors, since many short letter patterns can be adjusted to resemble one if spelling is uncertain. A decoder who expects a particular person may find that person everywhere. Blind testing helps by withholding candidate names until the rule is established. You close the interview folder before returning to the transcription, trying for a few minutes to see only forms, positions, and recurrence, rather than the biographies waiting nearby. Places can be tested similarly through historical databases, though records from the late 1990s may be scattered across printed directories, archived maps, and local files. Businesses close, streets change, and informal names never enter official indexes. A corner shop may be remembered by an owner's first name rather than its legal title. If Ricky abbreviated such a place, even a correct decoding might produce a term no current search recognizes. You imagine the old storefront glass reflecting buses and summer traffic, while its spoken name fades from the documentary record. Theories involving ordinary errands deserve equal attention because they match the list-like appearance of portions of the notes. A sequence could refer to food, clothing, payments, or visits, with repeated marks indicating quantities or completion. Such content might not advance the investigation directly, yet identifying it would reveal how the system works and allow other passages to be read. The humble line can unlock the consequential one. You place a hypothetical shopping list beside the code, not as an answer, but as a reminder that daily life often provides the clearest crib. Olson once observed that even discovering a grocery list or love letter would be worthwhile because the unknown system itself remained important. That view contains the patience at the heart of this case. Investigators don't get to choose whether evidence is dramatic. They learn what it is and let its value emerge afterward. A tender message, an appointment reminder, or a record of small debts could each supply vocabulary for another page. You leave space for the ordinary, where truth often waits without announcing its importance. A love letter theory would face its own structural questions, since the notes lack obvious greetings, sentences, or signatures. Yet private affection can be abbreviated as deeply as any errand, especially if written only as a prompt rather than a message to be delivered. Repeated initials might preserve a person's presence without describing them. Nothing in the public analysis confirms this possibility, and nothing entirely excludes it. You let the idea pass through the room, like the faint scent of paper warmed beneath a lamp, gentle and unclaimed. The physical folds may offer clues about how the pages were used. Repeated folding can show whether writing occurred before or after the paper was reduced, while wear along certain creases may indicate frequent handling. If marks cross a fold cleanly, the sheet was probably open when written. If lines avoid the crease, the writer may have worked on a smaller surface. Public images don't answer every question of this kind. You run a finger near the copied fold without touching the ink, aware that an evidence examiner holding the original would feel details unavailable to us. Ink or graphite analysis might distinguish writing sessions if different instruments were used, revealing whether the pages were composed at once or over time. Variations in tone can appear in photographs, but lighting, scanning, and paper texture complicate judgment. If separate sections were added on different days, repeated clusters might belong to recurring activities rather than one continuous message. That knowledge would reshape segmentation. You imagine the paper returning to a pocket after each edition, gathering warmth, lint, and new creases as the private record slowly grew. The order of the two pages also deserves caution. Investigators label and present them in an order, but the writer may have begun with either sheet or used both at different times. A supposed continuation might actually be an earlier list, and a heading-like cluster might belong to the middle of the writing process. If the pages were torn from a larger source, missing neighbors could contain the needed context. You place them side by side rather than one above the other, allowing their relationship to remain an open arrangement. Edges and tiers can sometimes identify whether sheets came from the same pad, while paper composition may suggest a common origin. Matching fibers, ruling, or dimensions wouldn't decode the message, but they could show whether the pages were created together. If they came from different sources, similar writing would suggest a recurring system used across settings. The public discussion has focused mainly on the visible characters, leaving many material questions outside ordinary view. You remain at the desk, listening to the slight crackle of copied paper and wondering what the originals reveal through touch. When codebreakers lack enough text, they sometimes seek side information about the writer's routines, vocabulary, education, and environment. This isn't an attempt to reduce a person to statistics, but to identify the likely building blocks of the message. Ricky's familiar streets, workplaces, acquaintances, and modes of travel might supply candidate terms. Still, biographical reconstruction must avoid turning rumor into a key. You read each interview as a human recollection shaped by time, affection, frustration, and grief, not as a clean dictionary of symbols. The case file contains competing impressions of Ricky, and those differences warn against assuming a single, simple portrait. Some descriptions emphasize his difficulty with conventional literacy, while others call him capable of reading, writing, and navigating city life with practical intelligence. A private notation could fit within either account. Human ability isn't measured by the neatness of a sentence or the complexity of a cipher. You let the pages testify only to what they visibly show: repeated forms, deliberate marks, uncertain divisions, and a writer who expected some kind of use. Perhaps the most important unseen element is the situation in which the notes were written. A person recording information at a quiet table writes differently from someone standing, traveling, listening, or copying spoken instructions. Hurried conditions produce omissions and unstable shapes that can imitate encryption. If Ricky wrote while another person spoke, the clusters may capture sounds or key details rather than complete language. You hear a bus engine idling in the imagined distance, then let that sound fade, because setting can guide inquiry without becoming fact. Copying introduces another possibility. The writer may not have understood every element being recorded. A person can reproduce codes, identifiers, or unfamiliar names imperfectly, creating errors that defeat systematic decoding. Repeated groups may then differ because of miscopying rather than deliberate variation. If the pages were transcribed from speech, similar sounds could receive different spellings. You compare the near matching sequences again, seeing how one altered character might represent a meaningful distinction, a mistake, or simply the pen lifting too soon. Errors are common in real ciphers and private notes alike, but cryptanalysis handles them best when longer text provides redundancy. Here, a single mistaken symbol can destroy a short pattern on which an entire theory depends. Allowing for errors is reasonable. Allowing unlimited errors is not. The patient decoder must estimate how many irregularities a plausible writer and setting might produce. You mark uncertain positions in pale pencil, keeping them visible without letting them become convenient escape hatches for every failing solution. There is a gentleness in this kind of work because it requires living beside incomplete understanding without forcing closure. The analyst returns after weeks away, notices a spacing habit, tests it, and perhaps sets the page aside again. A public solver spends winter evenings comparing clusters, then writes a careful note explaining why the idea didn't hold. Each abandoned method narrows the field slightly, though the narrowing may be too subtle to see from outside. You turn off one theory at a time, like lamps in distant rooms, leaving the central page softly lit. Years can pass in that rhythm. Software improves, archives become searchable, and new generations encounter the images with no memory of earlier publicity. Some begin from scratch, unknowingly repeating methods tried in Quantico or Niagara Falls, while others build on published observations about recurring symbols. Repetition of effort can seem wasteful, yet independent rediscovery sometimes confirms which features truly stand out. The McCormick notes continue to gather attention because their surface remains accessible, even while their inner arrangement stays private. New computational tools bring both promise and fresh caution. Pattern recognition systems can compare the notes against vast bodies of language, abbreviations, maps, and known ciphers, proposing connections too distant for manual search. But a machine trained to complete patterns may produce fluent guesses where evidence is thin. Coherence isn't the same as decryption. You ask the system for its rule, apply that rule to every line, and verify whether the output was derived rather than imagined. The old standard remains calm and unchanged beneath the newer technology. A persuasive machine-generated answer should be reproducible from the visible characters and should predict something outside its training prompt. If it names only facts already included in the question, it may simply be reflecting the supplied context. If different runs produce different confident readings, uncertainty has been disguised rather than resolved. The McCormick notes are particularly vulnerable to this because their ambiguity leaves ample room for plausible prose. You keep the original image beside every generated interpretation, letting the rough marks serve as a steady anchor. One proposed reading may produce directions, another a medical account, and a third a narrative naming supposed offenders, all from the same short lines. Their mutual contradiction reveals the danger. The notes cannot support every fluent story, even though each story may use familiar case details and sound internally complete. Patient decoding asks for mechanism before narrative. You cover the interpretations and study the source again, noticing how little the page itself has changed, despite the many confident voices gathered around it. The best next step may still be the oldest one, finding another authentic sample. A notebook, envelope, margin, or discarded form in Ricky's hand could reveal whether the same clusters recur and what kinds of information sit nearby. Historical photographs of family belongings might even preserve writing no longer physically available. Such a search would require care and consent, because family memories aren't merely investigative resources. You imagine an archivist opening a labeled box slowly, allowing every object to remain connected to the life from which it came. A second sample could settle multiple questions at once. It might confirm authorship through handwriting, demonstrate whether the system changed over time, and provide ordinary context for repeated symbols. If a coded cluster appeared beside a clearly recognizable address, one portion of the key might emerge. Other clusters could then be tested without guesswork. You feel how dramatically one small scrap could alter the room, though we don't pretend that such a scrap is waiting where anyone can easily find it. Until then, the existing pages continue to reward close observation more than broad claims. Repeated openings suggest categories, altered endings suggest variable information, and the parentheses may separate entries of a recurring type. None of these features supplies a translation, but together they describe a writing system with habits. You begin another clean table, placing related forms in rows and leaving uncertain characters blank. The pencil moves slowly, because the next useful insight may depend less on brilliance than on preserving one honest difference. You notice that some repeated groups sit near numerical material, while others occur mainly among letters. This distribution might reveal functional roles, such as labels paired with values or names paired with dates. To test it, every occurrence must be catalogued without overlooking awkward examples. Exceptions are examined rather than discarded. The work becomes almost meditative, a sequence of finding, copying, checking, and returning. Outside the imagined window, Evening settles over the archive, while inside we follow one recurring cluster toward its neighboring marks. A neighbor analysis records which symbols tend to appear immediately before or after each repeated unit. If the same neighbors recur, the cluster may be part of a longer fixed expression. If its surroundings vary widely, it may function as an independent word, separator, or category marker. The uncertain spaces matter less when adjacency itself is measured. You draw small branches from the central group, each ending at another character, until the notebook resembles a quiet winter tree. The branches don't form a simple picture. Some neighbors return, suggesting formulaic language, while others appear only once and may represent changing details. Formulaic writing would suit a list, log, or repeated instruction, where much of each entry stays stable. It could also suit copied phrases or a personal mnemonic. You compare the parallel sections character by character, letting similarities establish the frame before asking what the frame means. And one small variation begins to draw our attention toward the next page. The variation occurs near the end of a familiar sequence, where one symbol changes while the surrounding marks remain nearly identical. In ordinary language, that could resemble a changing suffix, a plural, a tense, or a name altered by one distinguishing letter. In a ledger, it might indicate different quantities under the same category, while in directions it could separate related destinations. You copy both forms onto a fresh sheet and align them carefully, leaving a little white space around the changing character. Alignment is a simple technique, yet it often exposes relationships hidden by uneven handwriting. Similar sequences can be stacked so that matching characters fall into columns, allowing additions, omissions, and substitutions to become visible. If variations recur in the same positions, the underlying units may have a stable internal structure. Here, several clusters seem related, but the uncertain transcription keeps shifting the boundaries by one mark. You move the paper a fraction to the left, then back again, and the possible pattern changes beneath the lamp. One interpretation treats the stable portion as a root, and the changing portion as grammatical information. Natural languages build families of words this way, adding endings or beginnings to convey tense, number, possession, or relationship. A private shorthand could preserve similar habits, even after removing most vowels. Yet codes, representing whole names or categories, can also create families that look grammatical by chance. You note the resemblance without naming it, because a pattern becomes safer when it is described before it is explained. Another interpretation reverses that emphasis and treats the changing character as the important value, while the repeated frame acts as a label. A form might mean root followed by a number, person followed by an action, or item followed by a quantity. Parentheses could then preserve a complete record whose components occupy familiar positions. This is common in practical notes, where the writer repeats only enough structure to recognize each entry later. You sketch a row of empty boxes beneath the sequence, giving each position a neutral place. The first box may hold a category, the second a name, the third a date, and the final box a status. But those labels remain hypothetical. Instead of filling them immediately, you compare which positions accept numbers and which contain only letters. Restrictions can reveal the kind of information carried there. A position that always contains a number likely serves differently from one that varies among several letter groups. The page begins to resemble a form without printed lines, a template existing only in the writer's habit. If that template extends across both pages, it could provide the strongest structural clue yet. You search for sequences with the same arrangement of letters, digits, separators, and parentheses, ignoring their exact values at first. Several passages share a loose shape, though none matches perfectly. Personal writing rarely repeats with mechanical precision, especially when composed quickly. The task is to decide how much variation a single template can tolerate before resemblance becomes wishful. You keep the threshold conservative, allowing the McCormick notes to remain irregular rather than pressing them into symmetry. A useful comparison comes from ordinary appointment books, where entries may vary while retaining recognizable roles. One line includes a person, time, and place. Another omits the place because the writer already knows it. A third contains only a reminder. Statistical regularity weakens even though the writer's purpose remains coherent. If Ricky's notes worked this way, missing fields might explain clusters that refuse alignment. You imagine him recognizing the omissions instantly, while we, lacking his daily context, mistake absence for an additional layer of code. Lists also encourage repeated verbs, especially words meaning call, meet, go, bring, or pay. In private shorthand, one of these could shrink to a single letter or stable group, appearing throughout the pages. Identifying such an action would organize many entries at once, but the same frequent cluster could be a person or location revisited often. You test the action hypothesis by examining position. Does the group consistently fall between something name-like and something number-like? The answer is suggestive in places and uncertain in others, which leaves the pencil hovering over maybe. The word maybe deserves a respectable place in every cold case notebook. It signals that an observation is worth preserving without being mistaken for fact, and it prevents early theories from hardening into memory. After enough time, investigators can forget which details came from evidence and which came from their own inference. Clear notation protects against that drift. You write observed, inferred, and speculative in separate columns. Then place each feature of the McCormick notes where it belongs, keeping the edges between them visible. Observed features include the presence of repeated clusters, mixed letters and numbers, parentheses, dashes, circles, and more than 30 lines of material. Inferred features include the likelihood of purposeful organization and the possibility that some marks divide entries. Speculation begins when a cluster becomes a road, medicine, name, or instruction. This separation may feel slow, but slow work is precisely what an old mystery asks of us. The pages remain cool beneath your hand as every certainty is returned to its proper size. The circles deserve renewed attention because they might have been added after the surrounding text. If so, they record a second moment of use, perhaps marking something completed, important, cancelled, or reviewed. Differences in ink tone or stroke order could help establish this, though public reproductions may not preserve enough detail. A circle drawn first would shape how later writing fits inside it, while a circle drawn last may curve around an existing cluster. You follow one arc with your eyes, watching it avoid nearby marks with a faint suggestion of care. Completion marks would support the idea of a working list, something carried and consulted rather than a message merely stored. Where along the folds might also fit repeated handling, yet circles can carry many meanings, including correction, grouping, or simple emphasis. A decoder must avoid translating a familiar office habit directly into Ricky's private practice. You may circle completed tasks in your own notebook, but he may have used the same gesture differently. The apparent familiarity invites empathy, though it doesn't grant us access. If the pages were consulted repeatedly, their order may reflect practical priority rather than chronology. Items could be grouped by location, person, or urgency, though nothing in the tone of the marks tells us which. A later edition might occupy an earlier blank space, breaking the sequence that decoders assume. Ink analysis and stroke overlap could help reconstruct the writing order on the originals. You imagine an examiner turning the sheet beneath angled light, searching for the tiny ridge where one line crosses another, letting physical evidence establish a sequence. Reconstructing sequence can clarify whether the notes were composed in one sitting. Consistent pressure and spacing might suggest continuity, while abrupt changes could mark separate sessions. A single session would favor a connected message or copied record, whereas multiple sessions might favor a list or log. Neither conclusion would be absolute, but each would narrow the field. You place small arrows beside possible additions, and the static page begins to acquire a quiet history of returning hands and interrupted thoughts. The paper's size and origin could offer further context. A sheet torn from a common notebook suggests availability rather than ceremony, while a fragment from a form or envelope might connect the writing to a particular place. Watermarks, ruling, perforations, and torn edges sometimes identify how an item entered someone's possession. These details rarely appear in popular discussions of the McCormick notes, where attention settles naturally on the cipher. Yet, detectives often learn from the object before they learn from the message, and you turn the copied sheet as though its blank reverse might still speak through texture. The reverse side may carry impressions from writing once placed above or below it. Oblique light and specialized imaging can sometimes reveal pressure patterns invisible in ordinary photographs, perhaps preserving fragments from another sheet. Such impressions could provide the additional sample analysts have long wanted. Whether examinations of that kind produced anything useful hasn't been publicly established. You allow the possibility without inventing a result, hearing only the soft movement of paper against paper in an evidence sleeve, where unseen strokes may or may not remain. Fingerprints and trace material could establish handling, though decades of storage and necessary examination complicate their value. The notes passed through official hands before their significance as a coded system became widely known, and preservation standards may have focused on other needs at the time. Even a clear print would require a known comparison and careful interpretation. The object can tell you that someone touched it, not why. You leave that line of inquiry with the laboratory, where gloves whisper against plastic and every contact is recorded with care. Our own task returns to the visible writing, because that is what thousands of public decoders received. High-resolution images allowed enlargement, contrast adjustment, and side-by-side comparison, but they also encouraged readers to treat uncertain strokes as perfectly recoverable data. Sharpening can create false edges, while compression can merge faint marks or break continuous ones apart. A clean transcription may therefore look more authoritative than the source deserves. You keep small question marks beside doubtful symbols, accepting that uncertainty must travel through every later calculation. Some solvers create several parallel transcriptions, each reflecting a plausible reading of ambiguous characters. Algorithms can then test all versions rather than committing prematurely. This expands the search dramatically, but it prevents one mistaken S or 5 from quietly ruining a correct approach. The method resembles walking several nearby paths through fog, marking where they converge and where they separate. You don't need to choose immediately. The McCormick notes permit us to carry uncertainty forward, provided we label it instead of hiding it beneath precision. Character clustering can assist by comparing the shape of every repeated mark. A computer measures curves, angles, and proportions, grouping forms likely produced by the same intended character. Yet handwriting varies naturally, and neighboring strokes can distort the comparison. The system may divide one letter into several categories, or merge distinct characters together. Human review remains necessary, especially where the pen moved quickly. You watch the clusters assemble on the screen, each small image cut from its line, and notice how lonely a character looks when removed from its neighbors. Context usually helps a reader distinguish ambiguous letters, but context is precisely what the cipher withholds. In normal handwriting, you know that a blurred shape completes a familiar word, so perception resolves it automatically. Here, the same helpful instinct can create circular reasoning. A proposed word determines the character, and the chosen character then appears to confirm the word. You resist that loop by recording the visual form independently before testing language, keeping the eye's judgment separate from the mind's preferred reading. The repeated NCBE-like cluster provides a useful example of this caution. Its appearance has been counted by outside readers, but even its exact form can vary depending on whether certain strokes are read as letters, separators, or connected marks. If it represents one stable unit, its recurrence is important. If several visually similar units have been merged, the frequency has been overstated. You compare each occurrence at the same magnification, noting differences in slant and spacing, and the once solid group becomes a family with uncertain boundaries. A family can still matter. Related abbreviations may share a core while changing one component, especially when they refer to connected places or people. Repeated copying can also introduce small variations without changing intended meaning. The analyst asks whether differences are systematic or merely graphic. A systematic difference recurs in the same position and may carry information. A graphic difference follows pen movement and may not. You trace the forms without pressing, listening to the near silence of the room while classification proceeds one stroke at a time. The PRSE-like sequence raises similar questions. Its recurrence may connect sections of the notes, perhaps marking the same action or category. Some readers see the E-like ending as a separator attached to the preceding group, while others treat it as part of the group itself. Both choices alter how frequently related units occur. You create two tables and refuse to merge them until one version explains more, with fewer exceptions. This is not indecision. It is a way of preventing an early boundary from becoming an invisible command. The WLD-like group appears often enough to attract theories of its own, especially because an apostrophe-like mark sometimes seems to follow it. That resemblance can suggest an English possessive or contraction, but the mark may have another purpose entirely. If the group represents a place or person, the added stroke might indicate association. If it represents an action, the same mark could separate the next item. You read the surrounding sequence slowly, then set pronunciation aside, because familiar-looking punctuation can lend false confidence to an otherwise unknown system. Numbers such as 71, 74, and 75 have encouraged interpretations involving roots or years, partly because they appear within similarly shaped passages. The attraction is understandable. Ordered numbers feel like coordinates on a known grid, yet they may be separate digits, copied identifiers, ages, quantities, or characters whose resemblance to numbers is imperfect. A decoder should first establish whether the writer distinguishes 7 consistently from other angled marks. You compare every apparent 7, finding a shared gesture in some, and an uncertain variation in others. If those figures are years, their surrounding context should behave like references to past events. If they are roots, adjacent clusters should plausibly name destinations or instructions. If they are quantities, repeated items might receive different values. Each hypothesis makes predictions about neighboring structure, allowing the page to test the idea without revealing full meanings. You build 3 separate models and watch where each becomes strained. None yet explains enough, but the comparison clarifies what future evidence would need to show. Historical bus schedules offer one concrete test for the route model. You would need schedules from the correct year, including route changes, branch numbers, transfer points, and local names used by riders. Then the numerical order could be compared with plausible travel between Ricky's known locations. Even a strong match would require caution, because commonly numbered routes cross many lives. Still, this is the sort of bounded inquiry that can move beyond free association. You unfold the period timetable in imagination, its thin paper carrying a faint smell of ink and dust. A timetable also provides abbreviations, which may resemble some letter clusters if the writer copied signs or route labels. However, matching a few initials isn't enough. The sequence of transfers and times should align coherently. A route interpretation becomes valuable when it reconstructs a journey that records can independently support. Otherwise, it remains one of many overlays. You run a fingertip from one printed stop to the next, noticing how a city becomes a chain of ordinary weights, while the coded page refuses to identify which stop, if any, belonged to Ricky. Road maps from the period can test highway interpretations in the same way. Exits may have been renumbered, businesses may have changed names, and new construction can make modern maps misleading. The analyst returns to 1999 rather than asking the past to fit the present. Archived directories, aerial photographs, and municipal records restore portions of the landscape, though informal meeting places may remain invisible. You sit with the older map until its faded colors feel current again. Then compare the symbols without allowing nostalgia to become evidence. The geography around St. Louis complicates simple route stories because rivers, bridges, county lines, and transit boundaries shape movement unevenly. A short distance on a modern map may have required several transfers or a car in Ricky's time. The rural location where he was found lay outside his ordinary downtown surroundings, making transportation an important investigative question. Yet the notes don't plainly answer it. You keep the city map and the St. Charles County map adjacent, separated by a narrow strip of desk that seems to hold the unrecorded journey between them. Known movements before the 30th of June provide only scattered anchors. Reports placed Ricky at medical facilities shortly before his death, and investigators examined his contacts and recent activities. Each anchor can be compared with the possible dates or routes in the notes, but the intervals remain wide. A person's day contains many unrecorded conversations, rides, and pauses. You mark confirmed events with firm dots and uncertain reports with open circles, letting the timeline remain honest about its gaps rather than smoothing them into a continuous story. The notes may have been written during those gaps, though the Bureau's estimate that they were composed within 3 days remains an investigative belief rather than a timestamp printed on the pages. That estimate likely drew from condition, context, or information not fully visible in the public presentation. If correct, it narrows the relevant world considerably. If uncertain, older entries remain possible. You pencil a soft bracket around the final days and avoid sealing it, because even a useful time frame must retain the degree of confidence with which it entered the file. Time can sometimes be inferred from writing content if a decoded reference corresponds to a dated event. Without decoding, material examination may offer only broad ranges based on ink, paper, and wear. Environmental exposure within a pocket could also affect the pages, though interpreting such effects would require expert knowledge and controlled comparisons. The notes survived well enough to be examined, but survival doesn't reveal when each line was formed. You hold the chronology gently, aware that an old page can preserve marks while withholding the hour of their arrival. Public decoders often seek a single elegant key that will transform everything at once. The appeal is natural because famous ciphers are remembered through the moment a hidden system suddenly becomes visible. The McCormick notes may not offer that kind of revelation. Their solution, if one comes, could emerge gradually through handwriting identification, contextual matches, and partial meanings established one by one. You imagine a mosaic assembled from worn pieces, where no single tile displays the picture, yet each verified placement makes the next one slightly less uncertain. A partial solution must still be presented cautiously. If one cluster is linked to a place through independent evidence, that doesn't mean every similar cluster has the same role. Private systems can reuse letters, and abbreviations can collide. The decoded portion should be treated as a foothold rather than a master key. You write the confirmed meaning in ink and the related guesses in pencil, preserving the distinction for whoever opens the folder years later. Patient work thinks not only about today's insight, but about tomorrow's reader. Cold case files depend on that continuity. Detectives retire, analysts transfer, software changes, and institutional memory can thin unless reasoning is documented clearly. A future examiner should know which methods were tried, what assumptions they used, and why results were rejected. Otherwise, years can be spent retracing paths without learning from them. The McCormick notes have traveled through several generations of attention, and their analytical history is itself evidence about what ordinary methods could not do. Imagine the working log maintained by a careful cryptanalyst. Each entry records a date, transcription version, proposed system, parameters tested, and result, followed by a short note about remaining anomalies. There is no drama in these pages, only disciplined accumulation. The paper may be smooth and white at first, then softened at the corners by repeated consultation. You turn through that unseen log and feel the scale of effort concealed behind the simple public phrase that standard approaches reached walls. A wall in cryptanalysis isn't always an absolute barrier. Sometimes it means the present sample is insufficient, the assumed language is wrong, or the key depends on missing external knowledge. Sometimes it means the material isn't a cipher of the tested type. Naming the wall precisely determines what should happen next. You don't keep pushing the same method harder merely because it is familiar. Instead, you examine the surface, look for another entrance, and accept that waiting for new evidence may be the most rational form of progress. Waiting doesn't mean neglect. Evidence must be preserved, digitized, indexed, and made available to authorized reviewers, while incoming tips are compared against known facts. Improvements in search technology may turn an old name or address into a new connection. A family member may remember a phrase after seeing the handwriting again. A similar note may appear in an unrelated archive. The case stays receptive, much like a quiet receiver tuned to a frequency that has not yet carried a clear voice. Recognition may ultimately matter more than decryption. Someone familiar with the notation could identify it immediately as a local shorthand, workplace convention, game, or personal habit. This was one reason the Bureau sought public help, asking not only for solutions, but for similar samples and contextual knowledge. Pattern recognition rooted in lived experience can succeed where abstract analysis stalls. You picture a reader pausing over the image because one cluster resembles something seen long ago on a receipt, a wall calendar, or a co-worker's pad. Such recognition would need verification, of course. The similar sample should share multiple distinctive features, not merely a few common letters or parentheses. Its origin, date, and author would matter, as would whether its meaning could be independently established. If the systems align, analysts could compare recurring units and reconstruct a vocabulary. You leave room at the edge of the desk for that hypothetical document, its absence almost physical beside the two familiar pages. The search for similarity can range across shorthand manuals, trade notations, prison writing systems, linguistic scripts, and regional habits. Analysts likely considered many such comparisons, though public descriptions summarize rather than catalog every test. Most conventional systems have recognizable inventories or structural rules, and the McCormick writing hasn't been matched publicly to one. That pushes attention back toward idiosyncratic shorthand. You browse an imagined reference shelf, feeling the cloth spines and thin paper guides, while each known system closes without taking the notes fully inside. Trade notation would require some connection to Ricky's work or daily activities. Particular jobs develop abbreviations for products, quantities, locations, and repeated procedures, often incomprehensible outside the workplace. If the notes reflect such a system, former co-workers or period documents might provide the missing vocabulary. Yet matching must be based on actual forms, not simply on the broad possibility that workplaces use shorthand. You turn toward employment records, where job titles and dates offer a modest beginning, and listen for the rustle of another folder. Medical notation presents a comparable route. Hospitals and clinics use abbreviations, but professional conventions from the period are documented and can be tested against the visible clusters. A patient's personal record, however, may combine copied fragments with misheard terms and private reminders. Ricky's visits shortly before his death make the idea relevant, though no accepted medical reading has emerged. You compare the numerical forms with appointment patterns, keeping the antiseptic scent of an imagined corridor gentle and distant, while evidence remains thin. Medication names are long and often compressed, so consonant-heavy clusters can resemble them after enough adjustment. This creates the same risk seen with place names. A convincing identification would require dosage structure, repetition consistent with use, or a confirmed prescription matching the period. Without those supports, similarity in a few letters is weak. You close the pharmaceutical reference and note that the hypothesis remains testable if records provide the right comparison. Then return the page to the quieter category of unknown. Gambling notation can also be highly compact, mixing initials, numbers, and marks showing wagers or outcomes. Public suggestions have therefore treated the notes as betting records, especially where entries resemble amounts or paired values. Historical betting slips could supply structural comparisons, but no publicly accepted match has been demonstrated. The format must align across more than one line, and the numbers should behave consistently. You hear the faint scratch of a pencil in a crowded room, then let the imagined setting dissolve before it hardens into assumption. Vehicle identifiers were another proposed path, because long letter number combinations can record license plates, parts, or identification numbers. Their standard formats provide useful constraints, which makes the theory comparatively easy to test. If the clusters don't fit the lengths, allowed characters, and check structures of the relevant period, the idea weakens quickly. Some public submissions invoked such records, but none produced a known breakthrough. You appreciate the clarity of a theory that permits itself to be ruled out, a small virtue in a case filled with flexibility. Directions encoded through initial letters remain harder to dismiss. A sequence might mean turn left, walk, cross, or continue, with numbers marking distance or route. Repeated action abbreviations would naturally recur, while place-specific terms vary. To test this, the sequence should produce a coherent path under one consistent vocabulary. You attempt several neutral assignments and find that freedom multiplies too rapidly. Every intersection offers several choices, and without one confirmed destination, the path wanders beyond the page's support. A decoder can reduce that freedom by using constraint-solving software. Rather than guessing complete sentences, the program assigns possible functions to units and eliminates combinations that violate observed patterns. Known locations, dates, and transit links can serve as external constraints, though they must be weighted according to reliability. The output may identify a small set of structural models instead of a single translation. You watch possibilities narrow on the screen, not to one bright answer, but to several quieter shapes deserving closer inspection. Bayesian reasoning offers another calm framework, even without formal equations. Each hypothesis begins with some prior plausibility based on Ricky's circumstances and the note's appearance. New evidence then raises or lowers that plausibility according to how well the hypothesis predicted it. A theory shouldn't become certain merely because one fragment fits. You update gently, letting several possibilities remain alive at once, and the notebook begins to resemble an investigation rather than a contest between confident stories. For example, a route theory gains modest support if several numbers match period transit lines, but only strong support if surrounding clusters predict connected stops independently tied to Ricky. A medical theory gains modest support from recent hospital visits, but more only if the notation matches documented medicines or appointments. Personal shorthand begins broadly plausible because of the format, yet remains too general to decode anything by itself. You can feel the difference between plausibility and proof settling into the work like dust, soft but necessary. Cognitive bias doesn't disappear with experience, which is why procedures matter. Analysts may become attached to a theory after investing many hours, while newcomers may undervalue earlier work because they haven't felt its constraints. Blind comparison, peer review, and complete documentation help counter both tendencies. The McCormick notes benefit from fresh eyes, but fresh eyes should still inherit the map of tested ground. You place the old working log beside the new transcription, allowing novelty and memory to share the same table. Public collaboration could be organized similarly, with standardized transcriptions, shared datasets, and clear criteria for evaluating proposed solutions. Each theory would state its rules, decode both pages completely, identify uncertainties, and list testable predictions. Competing readings could then be compared without relying on confidence or narrative appeal. Such structure doesn't guarantee success, but it turns thousands of isolated attempts into cumulative work. You imagine a quiet digital archive where every careful failure leaves a useful signpost for the next visitor. The danger is that open collaboration can also spread unsupported claims faster than corrections. A dramatic partial reading may be repeated across forums until it appears established, even when its key changes from line to line. Later solvers begin from that false certainty and build increasingly elaborate interpretations. Returning to primary images and official facts becomes essential. You clear the desk of copied claims for a moment, leaving only the 2 pages, the known timeline, and the gentle rule that every meaning must earn its place. Names of suspected individuals require particular restraint. A cipher solution that appears to identify someone can affect real people and families, especially when the method is uncertain. No name should be treated as meaningful unless the decoding is reproducible and supported by independent evidence. The unresolved nature of Ricky's death makes speculative accusation especially harmful. You cover the column of candidate names and return to neutral labels, remembering that patient investigation protects the living while honoring the dead. This restraint doesn't weaken the search, it strengthens it by keeping attention on information that can survive scrutiny. A verified route, appointment, or contact would matter more than a dramatic paragraph extracted through shifting rules. Detectives can then compare that information with records and interviews. The process remains slow, but slowness is preferable to error. You feel the folder's weight beneath your palm, not heavy because of spectacle, but because every line may touch someone's remembered life. The case's classification also shaped public understanding. Initial medical findings didn't establish a cause of death, while investigators nevertheless considered the circumstances suspicious, and the Bureau later described the matter as an open murder case. Those layers can appear contradictory unless you separate medical determination from investigative judgment. The notes became important partly because other physical explanations remained limited. You write both facts in the margin without forcing one to cancel the other, preserving the careful language each field used at the time. An undetermined medical cause doesn't reveal what occurred, and suspicion doesn't supply a mechanism. The gap between them is where interviews, movements, and contextual evidence must work. If the McCormick notes identify a recent destination or meeting, they could narrow that gap without describing any crime. Their greatest value may be logistical rather than confessional. You look again at the list-like structure, imagining not a hidden narrative, but a sequence of ordinary places whose order could quietly reshape the timeline. That possibility explains why investigators remained interested even after years of failed decoding. Knowing where Ricky had been could identify witnesses, transportation, or records that were never connected at the time. A place name may matter more than a complete sentence, yet places change, witnesses move, and memories soften, so delay reduces what even a correct reading can recover. You sit with that passage of time without urgency, hearing only the low archive ventilation and the almost imperceptible settling of paper. Old directories may preserve businesses that no longer exist, and tax records may identify owners or tenants connected to a coded abbreviation. Newspaper advertisements can reveal informal trade names absent from official registrations. Transit maps show how a person could move between neighborhoods, while hospital logs anchor particular hours. Each source adds a narrow band of context. You bring them toward the notes, one at a time, careful not to overwhelm the small text with a city's entire documentary history. Local knowledge could be especially valuable because residents often use names absent from maps. A vacant lot, corner store, housing block, or bus stop may carry a spoken label shared within a neighborhood. Initials in the notes might refer to such a place, leaving no match in national databases. Former neighbors could recognize the pattern where distant cryptographers cannot. You imagine a long-time resident looking at one cluster and hearing an old phrase return, softly, from a summer street in memory. Memory interviews decades later required gentle methods. Open questions reduce the risk of planting an interpretation, while showing only selected portions of the note can test recognition without revealing a desired answer. Several independent witnesses recalling the same usage would carry more weight than one prompted association. Any recognition should be documented in the witness's own words. You place a recorder on the table, its small red light steady, and allow silence to remain long enough for genuine recollection to find its own pace. Ricky's relatives might also distinguish handwriting habits invisible to outsiders, such as how he formed a particular letter or marked completed tasks. Their earlier disagreement with official descriptions makes renewed conversation delicate, and no one should be asked to defend memories shaped under painful circumstances. The purpose would be understanding, not correction. You approach the imagined family box with respect, aware that every scrap belongs first to a person's life, and only afterward to an investigative theory. A known signature offers limited comparison, because signing one's name differs from composing notes. Forms completed under supervision may contain only isolated letters, while the coded pages show rapid sequences and repeated habits. Better samples would include informal writing produced close to the same period, employment applications, personal cards, or annotated documents might exist, though access and authenticity would need careful verification. You leave several lines open in the evidence request, knowing the desired sample may be both ordinary and exceedingly rare. If a comparison confirms Ricky's hand, the private shorthand hypothesis gains support without becoming certain. Someone can copy another person's system, and one writer can use several notational styles. Still, authorship would focus contextual research more sharply on Ricky's vocabulary and routines. If authorship points elsewhere, the investigation would change direction. You hold both branches lightly, because the handwriting question sits upstream from nearly every decoding choice and may be the most valuable unresolved fork. Stylometry, usually applied to longer texts, offers little certainty here, but can still examine recurring formation habits. The shape of parentheses, the angle of dashes, and the way lines begin may function like stylistic fingerprints. Comparisons must account for writing surface, speed, health, and instrument. A cramped note written while standing can look unlike a calm form completed at a table. You study the slight lean of the characters, letting their rhythm suggest motion without pretending that motion identifies the hand. The writer appears to move forward with relatively few obvious hesitations, a feature that encouraged some analysts to see a familiar system rather than random experimentation. Repetition seems purposeful, and certain clusters are placed with confidence. Yet fluent production doesn't guarantee later readability by anyone else. People doodle repeated patterns fluently, and they also jot highly compressed reminders without pausing. You notice the continuous strokes and record only that the writer seemed accustomed to making at least some of these forms. Familiarity could indicate long practice, consistent with reports that unusual writing had appeared earlier in Ricky's life. It could also indicate copying from a source or repeating a short set of known labels. Distinguishing generation from copying might depend on errors, spacing, and line flow. A copied text may show glances away, uneven group sizes, or corrections. Though these signs are subtle, you follow the baseline as it rises and falls, imagining pauses between clusters while keeping the imagined source outside the realm of fact. The number of distinct characters may help distinguish systems. A small inventory suggests substitution, abbreviation, or constrained notation, while a large inventory may indicate mixed symbols or inconsistent handwriting. But counting depends again on deciding which forms are distinct. Two variations of one letter can falsely enlarge the alphabet, while two genuinely different symbols may be merged. You return to the character cards and sort them under softer light, allowing several uncertain piles to remain between the confident groups. Entropy measurements can compare the predictability of sequences with ordinary language and known cipher types. If certain symbols strongly predict what follows, the text may contain structured units. If transitions are nearly uniform, stronger encryption or non-linguistic generation becomes more plausible. With only 2 pages, estimates remain unstable, and transcription choices can change them. You let the computer calculate several ranges rather than one decisive value, treating the result as a contour map whose broad hills matter more than any exact coordinate. The transition patterns appear sufficiently repetitive to sustain the belief that the notes contain organization. What kind of organization remains open? A personal list, encoded narrative, copied ledger, or patterned private notation could each produce such regularity. Statistical resemblance can narrow families without selecting a member. You close the output window and hear the room become quieter, grateful for what the numbers have clarified and equally attentive to what they have not. A language model, trained on ordinary English, may score compressed shorthand poorly, even when the shorthand is meaningful. Training on text messages, diaries, and personal notes could improve comparison. But Ricky's individual habits may still lie outside any corpus. Models learn common patterns, while this case may depend on uncommon ones. The very quality that made the writing useful to its author may make it statistically lonely. You see the 2 pages as a tiny language community of one, carrying rules that were never required to become public. Building a custom model would therefore begin with context rather than scale. Candidate vocabulary from Ricky's known world could be combined with plausible abbreviation rules, then tested against recurring clusters. The danger is overfitting, where the model learns to reproduce the 2 pages without revealing their true meaning. Validation requires withheld information or a second sample. You construct the model only in outline, aware that a perfect fit to known data can still be a poor explanation of anything beyond the sample. This is another reason new evidence matters more than increasingly elaborate computation. A second authentic note would provide material on which competing models could make predictions. One method might decode it coherently, without adjustment, while another collapses. Until that test exists, complexity can imitate insight. You let the algorithms rest and return to the archive inventory, where a mislabeled box or overlooked scanned form may contain more value than another million possible keys. Archive searches themselves require patience, because names may be misspelled, files indexed under agencies rather than individuals, and older records preserved only on microfilm. Ricky's documents could appear under variants, initials, case numbers, or addresses. Each search path produces its own stack of near matches. You sit before a reader as the film advances with a soft mechanical whir, pale forms passing across the screen until one handwritten margin causes your hand to slow near the control. Most margins will belong to clerks, officers, or medical staff, so provenance must be established before comparison. A note found in Ricky's file isn't necessarily written by Ricky. Signatures, witness statements, and form instructions can help identify who completed each section. The same caution applies to family-held papers whose authorship may be remembered rather than documented. You label every candidate sample with its source and confidence, preventing hopeful resemblance from silently becoming accepted origin. If several authentic samples are found, chronology becomes important. A shorthand system may evolve, with symbols changing meaning or form across years. Earlier writing could still reveal stable habits, such as common separators or favored abbreviations, even when direct substitution fails. Later samples closer to 1999 would carry greater weight. You arrange them by date, leaving generous gaps where nothing survives, and watch the hypothetical language develop slowly across a life that official records captured only in fragments. Those fragments deserve compassion, because records often preserve people most fully at moments of difficulty. Medical visits, court documents, and police interviews can dominate the file, while ordinary kindnesses, routines, and private interests remain unrecorded. The notes may be one of the few places where Ricky organized his own experience, without an institution interpreting it first. Even unread, they complicate the thin, official portrait. You touch the edge of the copy, and remember that a code can conceal not only information, but the everyday person behind a case number. Patient decoding, therefore, includes resisting reductive assumptions about intelligence or education. Formal schooling affects familiarity with spelling and conventional writing, but humans build complex personal systems through memory, repetition, and necessity. A notation doesn't need theoretical sophistication to be difficult for outsiders. Its strength may come entirely from shared context no outsider possesses. You regard the cramped lines without romanticizing them, simply allowing their maker the full range of practical invention that any life can hold. At the same time, respect requires not assigning skill merely because the mystery has resisted experts. Difficulty can arise from poor data, transcription errors, missing context, or absence of stable meaning. The notes need not be a master cipher to remain unsolved. This distinction protects Ricky from becoming a character invented around the puzzle. You let him remain a man whose papers were found, whose death raised questions, and whose private marks continue to ask for careful rather than extravagant attention. The next structural comparison focuses on the parenthetical passages, aligning their openings and endings while ignoring uncertain internal spaces. Several begin with similar forms before diverging around their numerical portions. That arrangement could indicate a repeated phrase followed by varying information. You draw a horizontal line beneath the common segment and leave the variable section unmarked, allowing the template to emerge without naming its purpose. The pattern is gentle but persistent, like the repeated edge of a stamp pressed with slightly different pressure. If the common opening is an instruction, the variable portion might supply destinations or times. If it is a label, the interior could hold entries from the same category. Another possibility is that the parentheses contain examples, alternatives, or corrections rather than primary information. The surrounding lines should help distinguish these roles, but their own segmentation remains uncertain. You read outward from each parenthesis, one symbol at a time, and notice a neighboring cluster recurring, where a closing word or status might naturally stand. That neighboring cluster becomes the next item in the table. It appears near more than one enclosed passage, though not beside all of them, which may indicate an optional field. Perhaps it marks completion only when relevant, or perhaps the apparent association is accidental. You compare distance in characters rather than visual inches, accounting for handwriting width. The relationship weakens slightly under that measure, yet doesn't disappear, so you retain it as a low-confidence connection. Low-confidence connections can become useful when several independent observations converge. A cluster's position, neighboring numbers, and association with circles might together support one functional role more strongly than any single feature. This is how a structural interpretation grows without leaping directly to words. You add a thin line between the observations, not yet a bold one, and the diagram begins to reveal several possible entry types. within the McCormick notes, each waiting for one external fact to give it meaning. The most repeated entry type may offer the best starting point because it supplies multiple examples for comparison. Differences between those examples could identify variable fields, while common portions expose stable labels. You select 4 candidate lines and place them beneath one another, adjusting only for obvious spacing. A run of shared characters holds through the first section, then separates around the numbers before returning near the end. Your pencil pauses at that return, where a repeated closing form may be the first structural hinge, worth testing further. That possible hinge remains where you left it, lightly marked in pencil, useful enough to preserve, but not strong enough to bear a translation. Around it, the repeated groups keep their places, neither random nor readable, while the parentheses hold whatever distinctions Ricky once understood. You can let your hand rest beside the paper now, because patient work also includes knowing when to stop pressing an answer that hasn't arrived. The McCormick notes have endured every careful method without surrendering their meaning. No publicly verified decoding has explained both pages, and none of the proposed keys has produced a complete reading that investigators have accepted. Ricky McCormick's death remains unsolved. No one has been charged, and the questions surrounding his final movements are still open after all these years. The notes remain part of that uncertainty, preserved in case another sample, remembered habit, or independently confirmed detail someday gives their marks a dependable voice. For now, you close the folder without closing the case, allowing the pages to lie flat beneath their protective cover. The archive air is cool, the lamp is warm, and somewhere beyond the window, the city roads continue through the night, passing hospitals, old storefronts, bus stops, and quiet corners whose former names may survive only in memory. Ricky's writing asks nothing more from you tonight, and the unanswered lines can return to their long, undisturbed rest. You ease the lamp lower, leaving one soft band of light across the folder before the room settles into shadow. The marks remain exactly where Ricky left them, patiently holding an order that belonged to him, while every responsible decoder leaves enough silence around them for truth to arrive in its own time. Nothing has been forced into certainty, and nothing important has been forgotten. The file stays open in the darkness, but you may let it grow quiet now. As the paper rests, the questions soften, and the night carries you gently away.